The innovator is more likely to give up the quest for a rational core and to hunt for some other ground even more basic and realistic. This he will probably feel he has found in instinct. It looks as if an ethics based on instinct will give the innovator all he wants and nothing that he does not want.
This is Pints with Jack, Season 9, Episode 15. The Abolition of Man, Chapter 2, The Tao. Part 2, Instincts and the Tao.
Have you been looking everywhere, searching for a place where you belong? Away from the masses, among clinking glasses, where the hearth fire is on. Let the laughter welcome you in, that eagle and child din. There's room at this table, so take a seat and tuck right in. For Pints with Jack, Pints with Jack.
Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack. We are currently in the middle of the Abolition of Man, and last month we read through Chapter 1, which was Men Without Chests, and last week we started Chapter 2, The Tao, which we will be wrapping up next week. And this week, I am just quite excited. Just you guys, this topic here, we're really getting into the meat of it. I like it. I told the guys ahead of time that I'm excited for this chapter because I understood it, which is saying something. And so this is going to be a fun one. I think Lewis did very good with his communication here. But before we dive in, gentlemen, what is new?
Well, cheers, everybody. Just toiling away at church. Wonderful time there. And the three priests are out at various times this month. So each of us is taking turns covering everything. And I get to get some time with my wife and Diana Glyer, and we're going to certainly see each other. Matthew Clark will be there as well. So looking forward to some time away. I get to do a lot of cooking.
Well, I might be a little loopy today because I was godfather. Marie and I were godparents to her sister's second child, baby Margaret. It was her baptism in St. Louis. And so we drove there at 1 a.m. on Friday, and we drove back at 1 a.m. this morning. And then we stayed in a hotel with our children in the meantime. So, needless to say, I'm feeling a little tired, but it was really lovely, and it was actually kind of funny to be in St. Louis. And the name of the church where the baptism took place was St. Mary Magdalene. So,
nice.
Magdalene of a sort. It was funny. We went to look at the zoo, which is amazing, and the art museum that was there, and they had a big statue of St. Louis. I took a picture of it and posted it on Instagram with the comments like, it looks nothing like him. No pint, no walking stick, not even a single medieval text that he's reading. Can't see Tolkien anywhere. Rubbish.
Yeah. Oh, that's
I love
great.
it.
But I also go back home to discover that Jordan from the Less Known Lewis podcast, he sent Henry a book. And for those of you that can't see my camera, it's an essay collection of C.S. Lewis. He told me that he wants Henry to be more familiar with the Less Known Lewis works and not just spend all of his time on the larger works like his dad.
I love that. We are in the home stretch here. We are 2 to 3 weeks out from, Lord willing, birth. And so we are starting to get to the point, the crib, the stroller, all that stuff is here. We got kind of the nursery decently dialed in, got the hospital overnight bags. So we are in that fun stretch where I just literally can't wait. And we don't know if it's a boy or girl. So that's also just adding this level of surprise. And I can't wait. So listeners, prayers, please. Most likely when you're listening to this, the birth will probably have happened or about to happen. So any prayers would be great.
My couple of tips: do a practice drive to the hospital and also get that car seat in early. Because I think twice I have done it on the day that I'm bringing my child home. And that's just way too stressful.
That's great.
Well, gentlemen, what are you drinking today?
Well, in my Pints with Jack Imperial Pint Glass Junior, I've got Old Speckled Hen.
In honor of Jordan and the book that he sent my son, to try and lure him away from the straight path, I am drinking Moosehead, which is a Canadian lager.
Oh.
I poured a while ago a Athletic Brewing, and I still have a little bit left for a toast.
Okay.
Andrew, well, I would love for you to toast our new supporter, Sally Wilson.
Sally, we raise our glasses to you here in the new year after the Monday after the celebration of our Lord's baptism, praying that all of the benefits of our Lord's time here on earth and all of the vows that we make to one another may surround you and shower you and help you in your daily walk. And may our good wishes provide some of that help as well. Cheers.
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 All right. So, little recap as to where we've got so far. So in chapter 1, Lewis reveals how an English school textbook, which he calls the Green Book, teaches logical positivism. This is the philosophy which rejects all statements which are either not true by definition or they can't be scientifically verified. And as a result, in the book, pupils are taught how to debunk any sentiment, which Lewis says impoverishes the souls of the students. Providing evidence from throughout world history, Lewis demonstrates the doctrine of objective value, the idea that objects can merit our approval or disapproval, and that an emotional reaction may be congruous or incongruous. And he describes this doctrine using the Confucian term, the Tao. Jack considers the Latin proverb, which speaks about dying for one's country, and notes that the authors of the Green Book would wish to debunk such a sentiment. However, how might they then inculcate the virtue of bravery in the face of danger and death? Lewis begins chapter 2 claiming that any society which adopts the philosophy of the Green Book would destroy itself, but he doesn't reject it on that account. He points out the very fact that the Green Book has been written shows that the authors are trying to shape society in a particular way, thus demonstrating that they're not subjective about everything. And Jack suggests that such people often hold, with complete uncritical dogmatism, a whole system of values which they believe to be immune from their own debunking process. Lewis considers how they might, after debunking traditional sentiments, try to establish and justify their own values. And for this he returns to that question of dying for a good cause. How could this be justified and inculcated without the Tao? Would utilitarianism be sufficient? Well, no, because although it's helpful to society for some people to die so that it may be preserved, on what basis would a particular person be galvanized to make such a sacrifice? What about reason? Could reason provide a basis for why one ought to die for a good cause? And once again, we say no, because you can't get a conclusion in the imperative mood out of premises in the indicative mood. Or put another way, in David Hume terms, you can't get an ought from an is. Just because there are certain facts, that doesn't mean that you are therefore required or you should do something. And Lewis says that the only solution to this problem is to either expand reason to include what he calls practical reason, which is effectively the Tao, or they would have to find an alternative source of value, namely instinct. And this is what we're going to explore today.
Well, and those listeners who have read through Mere Christianity will see a piece of this argument in that written around the same time. But the way that he really develops is very compelling in this chapter.
I had that chapter from Mere Christianity. It's in book 1. It's called Some Objections, where Lewis deals with instinct. I think he is much clearer there, which is hardly surprising given Mere Christianity's audience.
Yeah.
But we'll circle back to Mere Christianity by the end. But in the meantime, Lewis suggests that after reason has failed, the next option that the innovators will choose is instinct. Why? What is the real advantage of trying to come up with a system of values based on instinct?
These innovators are people who are trying to come up with some whole new morality, some whole new way of doing things to dismiss the old. And so they're innovating. They're trying to say, here's a new way of approaching it. And they appeal to instinct, like the instinct of the survival of the species. And nobody needs to argue for instincts because we all have it. Preservation of society and of the species itself, Lewis says, are ends that do not hang on the precarious thread of reason. They are given by instinct. That is why there's no need to argue against the man who does not acknowledge them. And so instinct is something that everybody feels. And so everybody has it. And it seems to be a powerful and convincing argument. But Lewis picks it apart a little bit.
But before we get to the picking apart of the argument, what actually is the argument that is being made by somebody that is trying to establish a system of values based on instincts?
I mean, if I had to summarize it, it ends up being the North Star for everything. So if you think of millions of years of evolution, those instincts guide our behavioral actions and sort of prioritize them to some degree. And so instinct would say the urge to preserve species. That's why we ought to work for future generations. And so we ought to work to preserve the species. And then therefore, it's tempting to then say, which again, I think we'll dismantle a little bit later, it's tempting to say, well, then there can become the North Star of like, well, what about the urge to keep promises or respect to individual life? Well, the reality is those can be ignored when they conflict with preserving the species. There is a temptation. You can already see how it starts to feel like a morality, and there's objective rankings and values that can be added based on this instinct. I've kind of honestly fallen into it a little bit where I'm like, that kind of makes sense to me.
I'm actually kind of reminded of the Four Loves when it talks about the natural loves, the demands that those loves themselves make. And there's something I think very similar with instincts. They tell us very loudly what they want. And so we're rather tempted to take them at their word.
But this kind of indicative versus imperative, I mean, I'm holding up in front of the camera, I have this beer, but that does not mean I should drink it. I will drink it, but the fact that I have a good English pint is only a fact that I have a good English pint. The instinct, the species should be preserved, doesn't mean that I should do anything about it. And generally, if I agree that the instinct should be preserved, usually I want somebody else to do the preserving. I don't want to give up my life in order to preserve the species.
You should not drink that beer because that beer will hurt your gray matter and reduce the amount of brain cells and lower the ability for you to successfully pass on to the next generation. So you should not drink that beer, actually, for preservation of society.
Look how happy it makes him.
Malt can do more than Milton can to justify God's ways to man.
Well, actually, Andrew has just demonstrated something that Lewis says, if you're between the intellect and the belly always wins.
That's why we need the chest.
Well, yes. The thing that was kept rattling around the back of my brain as I was reading this section of the chapter was Western.
Yeah, I put that in this note.
Because we spoke about the preservation of the species and about how that can be seen as the greatest good. And if I have a strong instinct to preserve the species and less about particular individual lives, then it's easy for that larger, stronger instinct to override the others. And I think that's pretty much why we get Western. He cares about humanity, but not humans. But unlike other people, he is actually willing to even sacrifice himself. He would prefer to sacrifice other people first, but he is willing to put his own life on the line to see the plans fulfilled.
Right, but, even your description of Weston betrays the fallacy of his argument. He's willing to sacrifice his own life for the greater good, or the greatest good. Well, greater implies a standard between two things. This one is good, this one is better. Greatest implies that there is some standard by which I can say this is the best thing of all. And good as if it is an objective thing. What is good? What do I define as good? And how, I should preserve the species because that's the greatest good. By what standard? And this is what Lewis tries to get to the bottom of.
And we'll get to picking apart that argument in a moment. I did just want to mention one thing that he mentions in passing here, and it's important because the subject is going to come up again in chapter 3, and especially next season when we look at that hideous strength. And that related to the sexual instinct, and in particular, what modern technology has changed how we view it. So he says, we have a sexual instinct, a sexual urge. Nobody doubts that. And so if you're trying to build a system of values based on your instincts, well, we therefore give it as much free rein as we possibly can. We ought to give it as much free rein as we possibly can, as long as it doesn't interfere with the more important ones like the preservation of the species. And he makes the point that previous generations, there were lots of taboos around sex. And these taboos, these societal norms, they were geared towards preserving the species. But with the introduction of new technology, the more efficient forms of contraception, that means that the sexual urge can be more freely indulged without the need for those taboos. It's just worth pointing out the historical context that we are in when Lewis is writing this. By this point, we've had the Lambeth Conference, which was when the Anglican Church gave some very narrow accommodations made for the use of contraceptives. And in just a couple of decades, the pill would be available on the National Health Service and would start being very widely used. So he throws us in. He doesn't explore it any further, which I thought was actually surprising. I actually thought this was a really good case study to explore a little further. But I didn't want to pass over this section without saying this is going to come back later.
Well, and if you think about what happens in medieval English society or medieval Western society, arranged marriage is more prevalent. At least the community and your elders have some say, especially if there's a smaller pool of people to choose from. And you are less likely to marry somebody if, as back then was the case, divorce was not an option at all or almost ever. And contraception wasn't there. And so if I really had the hots for somebody and wanted to be with them, the only way I could do it is by making a binding lifelong marriage vow, right?
Mm-hmm.
But nowadays, divorce is possible and contraception is possible. And so I can indulge my sexual instinct without any apparent consequences. Mm-hmm. And that's part of what Lewis is saying. These innovations are actually a little further away from good. And I don't have an altogether Catholic view of contraception, but I certainly, there are some elements of that approach that really, and Lewis wisely points out, the sexual instinct has gotten inflamed in part because we've moved away consequences for it. And that's why he says in Screwtape, inflame his lusts, because a man who is thus inflamed has very little sales resistance, right? And so we can see society is trying to change our sexual morality, likely to foment some industry.
Mm-hmm. So now we come to the debunking process. What does Lewis think about this idea, using instincts as a good foundation for real values?
This is when he starts to enter in the idea of how do you actually pit one's instinct against the other? Which ones should be obeyed? Which ones should not be obeyed? Which ones are good? Which ones are bad? Like, the reality is, if you just kind of give into this idea that all instincts are good and you should give into instincts, which when you say it that way, by the way, side note, sounds ridiculous. I mean, I think we all know in our own life, if we just gave into all of our instincts, there's something deeply, deeply wrong with that. I think we would all say, well, maybe that's because some instincts got hijacked. Well, which standard are you determining which ones have been hijacked and which ones are not hijacked? That alone is a value judgment. And so he brings all that up, and he also makes the comment that they're sitting here writing this green book to try to influence a certain kind of direction. And the reality is that's pretty futile if we just have to obey our instincts. Like, why the heck are they writing this book if the standard is just instincts?
It's like a book that says, keep breathing. It's like, if I need a book to remind me to keep doing that, I'm not going to be lasting very long anyway.
Yeah.
I love, too, what he says in Mere Christianity. If we are only made up of instinct, sometimes I have to inflame one instinct and sometimes I have to tamp down an instinct. And what is that standard that I use to encourage one or to discourage another? It itself cannot be an instinct. He calls the instincts keys on a piano and says that somebody else is playing that piano.
And he picks apart what we actually mean when we say that these instincts will help us find real values. Is it that we must necessarily follow them? And we've already said, no, that's not the case, and pretty obviously not. Well, then is the argument that's being made that we'll be happier if we do follow our instincts. And this falls at his key test, which we began last week, the Dulcet Decorum Est, dying for a good cause. Am I going to be happier if I die for a worthy cause? Well, I won't actually be in existence, at least as far as the person suggesting this knows. I won't actually have any existence to have any happiness. I do think that situation does change, obviously, if you believe in an afterlife with punishment and reward. But it does seem that, well, if I'm not necessarily following these instincts and they won't necessarily make me happier, why ought I to actually obey them?
He more or less goes from, we must obey them because we can't help it, to, well, actually, maybe we can, but maybe the standard is we must obey them because they make us happy and satisfied. And he goes, well, that's not the case. And so now this is when he starts to get to that third option of an ought, we'll get back to. At least that's how I understood it when I was writing in the
I think that's the sequence that he goes through. I am actually going to say, I don't think this is the best written part of the Abolition, because he switches into the voice of the person who is making the argument quite a few times, and I got a little confused. But one man's opinion. Matt, you're right. I think he says, okay, it's not strictly necessary. It doesn't necessarily guarantee happiness. So is it that we just ought to follow our instincts? And that's just the is-ought problem all over again. Okay, I have these impulses. Why does that mean that I should follow them?
And what does ought mean? And what does should mean, right? I mean,
And as we mentioned earlier, what happens when my impulses conflict? We've mentioned that chapter 2 of Mere Christianity before, where he speaks about somebody crying for help, being swept away by the water. Well, I actually have two impulses. One, I want to help. Two, I want to make sure I stay safe. Something now has to negotiate between those two impulses to decide which one I ought to follow. And then, as you said, Andrew, I need to encourage the one that I should be doing, because it might actually be the weaker impulse.
That's control or indulge. That's what I put in the sidebar. And how do you determine that? That alone right there, is there something above the instincts for that to even be possible? There's no instinct that tells you how to control or indulge your instincts.
And you can't just look at it factually, like, how many times do I feel this impulse? Does that mean that I therefore should follow it? We had the steak tease in Mere Christianity, and Lewis is talking about how our sexual impulse is kind of crazy, really, in terms of what is strictly necessary and yet what it is. Just because you have certain impulses appearing, say, more often or with increased strength, doesn't still necessarily mean that you ought to obey it.
I do love here when he says, the judge cannot be one of the parties judged. Kind of summarizes this entire section.
Yeah, it's back to that idea of the loves and the four loves. They speak with the voice of God. They demand that you obey them. That's what every impulse does. It says, you need to do this right now. It's going to be great.
Yes.
I do want to say this real quick before we go to the next section. The idea that without appealing to any court higher than the instincts themselves, we can yet find grounds for preferring one above its fellows dies very hard. We grasp at useless words. We call it the basic, the fundamental, the primal, the deepest instinct. It is of no avail. Either these words conceal a value judgment passed upon the instinct and therefore not derivable from it.
It can't be derived.
Derivable. Or else they merely record a felt intensity, the frequency of its operations in its wide distribution. I liked that part.
Yeah, it's the David Hume idea, always staying very attentive to, wait, what have we just stated a fact? Or have we suddenly jumped to an ought? And if so, how did that happen?
It's not necessarily germane to this current chapter and the current argument, but I can't help but think about another piece of what goes on in Mere Christianity. When Lewis talks about the moral law, he also argues that we have this law, we call it a law of what I ought to do, but nobody ever keeps it perfectly. And so a rock has always obeyed gravity. It has always fallen to the ground as soon as I have opened my hand. But nobody follows the moral law, these kind of the perfect Tao, perfectly, even though we have this instinct that we should. And so that too points to, it points a bit to its origins, but this oughtness we carry with us. And like he says later on in the chapter, I'm not defending Christianity here. I'm not defending theism, but there is this sense of should, and there's also a failure to achieve the should. And that points to something. And of course, that gets right back to, book one, the title of book one of Mere Christianity, Right and Wrong is a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. A little far afield, but still in the same ballpark.
What's the final objection that Lewis offers to this idea of basing a system of values based on instinct?
Well, he asks whether or not there even is an instinct to preserve the species and says, I've never met a man on a bus who thinks more about posterity and futurity than their own goods, their own status. And so he says that this argument is of a particularly educated group of people in a particular age. And so he argues against the universality of that instinct.
And he even says that even though he was a man that has been educated in that fashion, and he's a fan of Olaf Stapledon, and I don't know who he was, but he's basically a sci-fi writer, so he's writing about the future of humanity, future worlds. Despite his proclivity towards that sort of work, he still doesn't find an instinct in him in that regard. And so it points more to nurture rather than nature. It's something that you are educated into rather than something that is actually a root instinct. Interestingly, he does think that we have an impulse to preserve our children and grandchildren. As a father, I can definitely say that's true. But he points out that it's after that the instinct starts to fade. Because, I can think of my kids, that's very easy. I can think of my grandkids, distant, but that's a possibility. But he says that as we pass from mother love to rational planning for the future, we are passing away from the realm of instinct into that of choice and reflection.
Yeah. Stapledon, by the way, Lewis quotes in the intro to That Hideous Strength. He says he is so rich in invention that he can well afford to lend, and I admire his invention, though not his philosophy, so much that I should feel no shame to borrow. So he points to Stapledon as being one of his influences. You think about grandparents who are so indulgent of their grandkids and how they'll even spoil their grandkids. Strict parents might make very indulgent grandparents. My grandmother was like that. I was regaled with stories of how strict she was. But then when my brother and I got to go spend time with her, she took us down the sugar cereal aisle and down the ice cream aisle and down the potato chip aisle and anything you want, and bragged about us. And so in some ways, that's an argument against the preservation of the species, right? If these people are biologically related to me, I should raise them as strictly as I did my children. But they become a different sort of thing and not this kind of necessary preservation of this the glorious ideal.
Well, I want to call out too in this section because Plato, it's all Plato.
Yeah.
And I love Plato. He says here, and he uses language, sounds like Plato's cave to some degree. If we are to base ourselves upon instinct, these things are the substance. And care for posterity, the shadow, the huge flickering shadow of the nursery happiness cast upon the screen of the unknown future. I do not say this projection is a bad thing, but then I do not believe that instinct is the ground of value judgments. Now, this part really stood out to me. I underlined this and put Weston. What is absurd is to claim that your care for posterity finds its justification in instinct, and then flout at every turn the only instinct on which it could be supposed to rest, tearing the child almost from the breast to cradle in kindergarten in the interest of progress in the coming race.
Well, and then there's that unexamined word, progress, and it comes from two Latin words. Pro means towards, and gradus, gressus, to step. And progress means to step towards something. But Weston and everybody else never stop and say, wait, what am I progressing towards? Progressive can be a positive value, but you need to ask, progressing towards what, right? What and why is that good? And then what standard are you using to say it's good, right?
And what are you willing to sacrifice for that? In this case, some distant future. Well, how many great regimes have been willing to sacrifice the blood and happiness of their own people for some utopian future, which of course never comes.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, according to Lewis, where does this all leave us?
Well, neither factual propositions nor appeals to instinct seem to be sufficient as a basis for a system of values. He uses other sources, of course. He quotes Confucius and Stoicism and Dante and Jesus and even the English philosopher John Locke. And he says all the practical principles behind the innovator's case for posterity or society or the species are there from time immemorial in the Tao, but they are nowhere else. Basically, he says the Tao is the one that says that we should care for people. We should care for our fellow man. And the idea that we should care for a future man stems from the Tao. You can't throw out the Tao. And, if you say, oh, well, the Tao says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but I'm going to throw that out and say, do unto those who are in the future as you would have them do unto you. They can't step away from the Tao, even if the innovators, quote unquote, think that they are.
I think the big take home for me in this section was the fact that these are starting principles. The Tao is the place that you begin. It's not the place that you try and actually argue to. He says, unless you accept these without question as being to the world of action what axioms are to the world of theory, you can have no practical principles whatever. You cannot reach them as conclusions. They are premises.
Mm-hmm.
And he says if you start trying to pick and choose out of the Tao, it becomes this universal acid. He says if nothing is self-evident, nothing can be proved. Similarly, if nothing is obligatory for its own sake, nothing is obligatory at all. You can't just take a bit here and a bit there and reshape a new Tao for yourself.
Yeah, this part I struggled with a little bit. I tried to understand it, and so I actually took pictures of the page and put it into ChatGPT.
Of course you did.
And it goes, Lewis is anticipating enforcing a choice. He's saying you have exactly two coherent options left. There's no third possible. The two options. One, treat basic moral principles as sentiments. If you do this, you cannot call them merely subjective. You cannot contrast real value with sentimental value. All value becomes sentiment, but not arbitrary sentiment. This already undermines emotivism and relativism. Lewis's point, if values are sentiments, they are still normative and shared, not private whims. Option two, which I think is what you were hitting home there, David, treat them as rational axioms, Lewis's preferred route. And here's a crucial line we're diving into. You must allow that reason can be practical, that an ought must not be dismissed because it cannot produce some is as its credential. Anyways, that's how it unpacked it for me.
I think ChatGPT is an excellent co-host.
We should replace Matt with ChatGPT.
Oh, I've already tried. I don't have enough credits. It's fine. You're cheaper.
In Wealth Architect, we actually used to joke in early stages, Colin and myself, that ChatGPT is our third co-founder. Because we would record all of our dialogues, all of our conversations as we were thinking through strategy and brainstorming, and then we'd feed them into ChatGPT as like a third kind of give us an outside perspective and help us see things from other angles. And it surprisingly was helpful.
I think it's actually very insightful what he says here about those who attack the Tao are actually just stealing from it.
Mm-hmm.
He says all the values which the innovator uses in attacking the Tao and even claims to be substituting for it are themselves derived from the Tao. If he had really started from scratch, right from outside the human tradition of value, no jugglery could have advanced him an inch towards the conception that a man should die for the community or work for posterity. He compares it to coming up with a new primary color.
Right. It's impossible. And they're using a system of values and yet using that to deny the system of values. I keep coming back to the same statement in Lewis. If the world were meaningless, we would never have been able to understand that it was meaningless. For me to say that the world is meaningless or that everything is meaningless is itself a meaningful statement. And so what I'm saying is everything is meaningless except the statement that everything is meaningless, right? And so you're playing with house money. And I think that Lewis does a really good job at, kind of showing how even the innovators are not imposing. And you see this in Weston because he starts out as just a materialist and a pragmatist, but then he adopts some religion, but even still, it doesn't work and it breaks down.
We've referenced chapter 2 of Mere Christianity quite a few times. This was a section that I wanted to wrap things up with, where Lewis says the most dangerous thing you can do is to take any one impulse of your own nature and set it up as the thing you ought to follow at all costs. There is not one of them which will not make us into devils if we set it up as an absolute guide. You might think love of humanity in general is safe, but it is not. If you leave out justice, you will find yourself breaking agreements and faking evidence in trials for the sake of humanity, and become, in the end, a cruel and treacherous man.
That's so good. Yeah, he's teaching us how to think, isn't he?
Any closing thoughts?
I do like what you said, David. I love that I'm glad that he teases it out here, but it seems much more philosophical and complex. And I like that it pairs with, at the same time, Mere Christianity. And I think in some ways points to Lewis's brilliance, because he's making the same argument in two different voices. It's a little bit like Mark Studdick writing the newspaper article, one for intellectuals, and kind of highbrow people, and one for the hoi polloi. Lewis is kind of doing the same thing. And I'm really grateful that we have the Mere Christianity, which kind of boils it down to an 11-minute broadcast.
Well, I'm proud of us, gentlemen. We kept that tight and within the allotted time. And that is the call for final drinks. And so we want to thank our stenographer, Julia, our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah. I will have to say, every single time I read this, I think to myself, we could just copy and paste this in. But guys, we are authentic, we're genuine, and we read it every time for you. Our Patreon supporters, particularly our top tier supporters, Jacob, Alex, John, Ryan, Dan, Jody, Dave, Brian, and Meg, Rebecca, Sarah, Mark, Kevin, and Paul, Bud, James, Robert, Mark, Matt, Erica, Joelle, Amanda, Thomas, Shane, Becca, Paul, Gary, Stephen, John, James, Kate, Peter, Rowdy, David, and Angela. And of course, we want to thank you guys for listening. We pray for you every episode, and share this with others. If you're enjoying this is definitely a foundational season for the Lewisian works and many themes that he has and other stuff.
And if you have enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on YouTube. Click like, share it with your friends. Order some merch, drink a pint with us.
And please join us again next time,
when we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.